I'm here today with Jim Belcher. Jim is a political philosopher, researcher, and writer. He previously served as president of Providence Christian College in Pasadena, California, and is associate professor at Knox Theological Seminary. Jim was the founding lead pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Newport Beach, California. He's the author of a book called In Search of Deep Faith and also Deep Church, which won a 2010 Christianity Today Book Award in Church Pastoral Leadership. His new book is Cold Civil War, Overcoming Polarization, Discovering Unity, and Healing the Nation from IVP. You can learn more at newvitalcenter.com. That's NEWVITALCENTER.com. So Jim, thanks for joining us and congratulations on all of your work.
Thanks, Brian. It's so good to be here.
Well, as we were talking beforehand, when I first heard the title of your new book, I said, okay, well, I've got to talk to Jim because it's so much in alignment with what I've been trying to do in the How to Heal Our Divides front. So I was really glad to see that you did this. But before we get to the book, tell us a little bit more about your background, if you could, than what I kind of briefly touched on.
Yeah. Again, it's good to be here. I'm a New England kid. Born in Boston. Grew up in the little state of Rhode Island. Very very much kind of in colonial New England. Come from a family that dates all the way back to roughly 1636. So the Great Migration that came over here, and then also my mom's side that are Swedish immigrants that came in around the start of the 20th century. Grew up in New England, went to Gordon College, which is a Christian liberal arts college. And I've been in nonprofit work either as a pastor, church planner in Newport Beach, Redeemer Presbyterian Church. I've taught in the seminary, Knox Seminary in Fort Lauderdale. And I was most recently the president of Providence Christian College in Pasadena. And now I'm writing and mostly these days working on my weekly Substack article on what's going on out there in the world. So it's good to be here.
Yeah. So, as you know, a lot of our audience are authors. Can you talk a little bit about how you got started doing that in addition to the other things that you do?
Yeah, after I finished the PhD, in my early 30s, when you go through that decade of higher ed, I also went to Fuller Seminary in Pasadena. I wasn't thinking about writing. I was planting a church. I was married and starting a family. We have 4 kids now that are growing. 2 are in high school and 2 are out. It wasn't something I was like, I wanted to write, but I think it was about halfway through my 10 years at Redeemer Church where I just felt like the church was struggling. There's a lot of conflict between kind of the traditional wing of the church and the emerging church. And I had friends on both sides. I had really good friends on both sides, and some of my friends were even kind of in the publishing wing of the new emerging church. And so I felt like I could be helpful, and I could use the church we were planting at that time, 5 years old, to use it as kind of as an example. And that's where Deep Church came out of that. And I interviewed lots of people, did a lot of the reading. I tried to understand both sides and be fair to both sides, but present a third way. So that was my first kind of, getting into doing writing. When I wanted to write the second book, which was In Search of Deep Faith, which was going to take us to Europe and investigate 10 of the heroes of my faith, at that point, we realized we had to leave Redeemer. So in 2010, after a decade, we stepped out, turned it over to the very able leadership and the elders and deacons that I had trained. And we went to Europe for a year. And that was very much the writing and traveling life. By the time I came back, I had a first draft. And then I was at Knox Seminary and had a position where I could write a number of days each week and work on the rewrite for that. But it's always a challenge. Like when I left Knox and went into administrative to lead a college, it was the first 4 years, I guess, maybe. I couldn't write anything other than maybe speeches I was giving, classes I was teaching. There was no time. But right around, I think 2016, just 2017, after Trump got elected and politics all of a sudden became the most popular topic around water coolers. I thought, I got to write something to help the church. It's just really arguing over this stuff, right? And I started getting up at 4:30 in the morning before I went off to my day job. And the first year, all I did was get up and spend 3 to 4 hours doing heavy research. It had been a while since I had really dug deep into my political philosophy. I was trying to read the political philosophy and then read the newspaper at the same time and figure out what I could say that could be helpful. A year into that research, maybe 6 months into that research, I sent a proposal to InterVarsity, which they liked, where I said, I want to try and explain why we lost we've lost a vital center, which has caused this polarization, why the polarization seems to get worse every week. And then what a new vital center could look like, how we could bring people together. And so I began that process. And for about a year, I was still getting up at 4:30, writing that first draft. And it was towards the end of that where I realized it was practically killing me. I got sick a few times in that last year. Right at the beginning of COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown, I stepped down. And I said, this project is so important for me and for the church in general that I need to finish this, and I need to do it without killing myself. So I was able during the early days when everybody was locked down to just write, go for long walks, listen to my Audible books, research all day, and keep writing. And so by early end of June 2020, the first draft was done. And then you go, writers know this, then it goes away. You don't have anything to do with it. It goes off and you're like, I want to keep writing, but it has to go to outside readers. It has to be looked at by your acquisition editor. COVID slowed things down. The length of my book, whether it should be academic or popular, took a little extra time. By the time I got it back, no fault of anyone's, was like October of 2020. And honestly, by then I was like, okay, this is a little bit of a dilemma, because if Trump loses, so many of my stories are going to immediately seem old because they were with a former administration, right? So it already feels like, oh, you wrote it in the past. So when Biden was inaugurated, and there was some doubt whether that was going to happen with all the turmoil going around, with the January 6th stuff, that I basically asked InterVarsity, hey, can I have an extra 3 or 4 months? And because I felt like I needed to rewrite it. Wow. And I spent 4 months and full time rewriting the entire thing. And every time you start a new chapter with a different story, it's going to reshape the whole thing. And I was also bringing in a lot of the suggestions. That the outside readers tend to be really good at InterVarsity, and I've always taken what they say seriously. And they, one of the things they said is, hey, in the middle section where you look at the polarization in the quadrant graph, it just needs more structure. And I thought, okay, I can do that. And so as soon as I wrote one of the 8 positions with a different structure, that meant I had to rewrite all of them that way.
Wow.
To help the reader. So it's okay. I mean, it's, you plow ahead and you get it done. And by July 1, roughly, of 2021, the second draft was done. It was a little late. InterVarsity is always very generous with that. And I was able to get it in, and then it's gone again. Here it is appearing, supposed to come out in February, and shortages of paper slowed it down by another 6 or 7 weeks. So it just came out last week, wow. Middle of March. And, at that point, there's nothing you can do as a writer, but just hope that when it appears, it's the right time and it's not too late. So that's the goal. But yeah, that's a summary of the process.
That's quite a saga. I mean, every book that I hear of, has got a different story behind how it got created. And, you've got a pretty unique timeline there, just as you said, because of the politics involved. Wow.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, as I mentioned, the title of the book is Cold Civil War, starts with Cold Civil War. Tell us about, what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I was searching for a word like everybody. What is polarization? Why is everybody hating on each other? All the jokes about going home for Thanksgiving and not being able to talk with anybody. And I came across the term from a scholar who just in an untimely manner just passed away, Angelo Codavilla. And I talk about him in the intro. and it's his term, Cold Civil War. And I thought, yeah, that's perfect. There's a type of civil war. It's not quite hot yet, right? There's no bullets and guns and tanks, excuse me, and bombs going off. But it certainly seems like a civil war that's cold in how we interact with one another. So I really like that. It was a good metaphor for what we're dealing with. It just feels like there's two nations warring against each other. We have two different ideas of what the country should be, what the Constitution says, and what it's said in the past. It's incredible, right? I mean, a week doesn't go by where something else happens in our country or the world where the two sides are galvanized on each side into tribes. I mean, it didn't take long for even the Ukraine thing, the Ukraine war and the invasion of Russia to just polarize people along very similar lines in how that is done. So it doesn't matter whether it's masks or mandates, the COVID lockdowns, you pick any social issue and the division is almost instant. And it seems like it's unbridgeable. Matt Walsh, who's a Christian blogger and podcaster, said, he used a different metaphor. He says there's no bridge now that can bring the two sides back together again. And he says it's gone. There's no way. And he's without hope that we can bridge this chasm. If you read the book, obviously, I still have hope. I believe that the ideas behind the American experiment and the people and the character of the American people throughout history are going to rally and not do away with what we've had. But but I understand the frustration. I mean, I understand where it just feels like there's just no way that we're going to bridge this chasm. So I just thought Cold Civil War. What a good title.
Well, I certainly agree with you. We have to do something, right? I mean, we can't just leave things the way they are. I don't believe. As difficult as it's going to be, no question about that. But to not try to talk to each other, to not try to improve things. I mean, that just seems ludicrous to me, quite frankly. But then anyway.
Right. Yeah, and part of what I was doing with the quadrant graph and kind of mapping people was so that, I mean, obviously it's a big part of how I explain the polarization and why we need to get back to a new vital center. But at the same time, I want people to be able to say, oh, I'm more in this quadrant, or I'm more in this quadrant, and I'm probably in one of the two or threes that Jim Belcher says are moving into the extremes, right? But at least there's a dialogue, and I tried to be fair with each one, even as I'm being critical, even as I'm analyzing them. But I wanted people to be able to say, okay, now I have a better understanding of where you are, because if we don't know the terms, it's much easier just to default to tribalism and to invective and just tearing one another apart, right, with ridicule. And so I wanted to spend the time kind of trying to understand all the positions that you hear that are out there.
Yeah, and so let's talk about the four quadrants a little bit, because you've modeled, kind of the world in that way, as opposed to, just two political sides, so to speak. So tell folks about those quadrants.
Yeah, so I tell a story in the book how when I was in grad school, I was at Georgetown doing a degree in political philosophy, and you just get hit in every class with thinker after thinker, right, through the history of political thought and then modern thinkers. After a while, it's like, whoa, where does everybody fit? And I would try and map them. And I started with just the left-right spectrum, right? You've got a conservative, you've got a liberal, you've got a left and a right. And I would always run into trouble when I would get to libertarians. I mean, libertarians, I couldn't understand, they wanted freedom. They wanted to break away from anything that would constrict them, any type of tradition or religion, anything that would or the state. And I was like, what are they doing on the right? But then, also around the time that Obama came in, and liberalism, which was all about freedom, 1960s kind of radicalism, all of a sudden started dictating to people how they should live. And I said, well, whoa, where's this structure and this order and almost this new moralism coming from? That doesn't really fit what I perceived as the left as I came of age in the 70s and the 80s. And I always struggled with that spectrum, other than it worked well for the theater of politics in DC and for fundraising. So it was while I was working through this that I thought, this isn't a spectrum. This is actually a quadrant. And I just bisected the spectrum. So you've got the left and the right, and I just bisected it. And I showed that how on the left, there's an upper quadrant or lower quadrant, right? And that's one is freedom, one is order, and the same thing on the right side. There's an order and a freedom side on that. And once I did that, I then kept doing my reading up at 4:30 in the morning. And every time I'd pick up a new book, I'd like, oh, I see where they fit. And I would put their name in one of those quadrants. And eventually I started seeing differences within the quadrants. So I kind of bisected the quadrants, and I put a 1 closest to the middle, 2 and the 3 as you went out in each of those quadrants. And then I started grouping people into those. And I said, this is interesting because there are people who are really kind of extreme in the quadrant, and there are people who fit in the quadrant, but they're closer to the older vital center. And then as I kept grouping those, I realized, a lot of it comes down to, where they fit in the 1, 2, and 3 part of the quadrant really comes down to how they see the founding. And it really comes down to, what they think about the Declaration and the Constitution. For instance, if they don't want to go back to the Declaration and the Constitution, I think we need to move on, they tend to not be in those one positions. But there were people in the one position on both the left and the right. So I began to, they eventually become the new vital center. But it was the 2s and the 3s. I saw the 2s kind of moving away from the center and then opening the door or pushing the Overton window further out so that the number 3s would be able to speak more. And what I noticed is those number 3 positions, which are the far extremes of each of the 4 quadrants, those are the ones speaking today. Those are the ones arguing in the street. Those are the ones kind of screaming at each other on cable news. They're the ones that are so far now from that vital center that it seems like a difficult task to kind of figure out how we're going to get back. But so that's how they came about.
Interesting. So one of the things that you mentioned also is, I'm quoting here, a uniparty in DC, an oligarchic control of the ruling elites. Can you talk about what you mean by those two things?
Yeah. So one of the things too that, and this became really clear to me when COVID hit. I think this became clear to a lot of people, but one of the things that we noticed right away that all the middle class businesses and working class jobs and businesses were being shut down. But the ruling elite, the ones that had the Amazons and the big business and the big box stores, they were all kept open. And I thought that's really curious. Is COVID immune to Costco and Amazon or the big box stores or whatever? Does it not affect the warehouses at Amazon? But all the small businesses, it's running rampant, and it's a super spreader event. And I thought this is really strange. What's going on here? Why are they destroying, the small businesses and shuttering the restaurants, which so many people depend on? And when I came across during my rewrite, I came across Joel Kotkin, who's kind of an old school Democrat, who was saying that this was the oligarchs' way of taking over and getting more control. What I began to see is, that's exactly what happened. They double and tripled their wealth while everybody else is verging on bankruptcy during the pandemic lockdown. But they also went after more control and more power as they locked down. Basic civil liberties were starting to be taken away from people, and we saw that a ton in California, where I'm from. They poured sand in skate parks, outdoor skate parks, as if COVID was spreading around skate parks, right? And all of a sudden, they were taking away a lot of basic liberties, and people on the left and the right started noticing this, and this kind of bipartisan kind of uprising, particularly in California, started taking place. But as I began to go through my writing the quadrants, the polarized positions, what I noticed is that the more we got the 4 quadrants kind of became more extreme, the more that conflict was kind of stoked by the oligarchic elites, the ruling elites, the bipartisan group in Washington, D.C. that's made up of both Democrats and Republicans, that controls Wall Street, controls Hollywood, that's involved in big tech, big pharma, big military. they began to almost kind of work together and use the conflict to make it worse. And so as Americans, we're caught up in kind of fighting for what we think is right. And, we kind of think we know what side is making things worse. What we don't realize is that a lot of it's theater, and there are obviously real philosophical issues behind it. Don't get me wrong. I spent a lot of time talking about it, but I think those differences are then stoked to make it even worse, so that instead of us dialoguing over these philosophical differences, we're taught to scream at one another, right? Or to yell at one another, or to, you see this on airplanes as people kind of go at each other in airplanes all the time. And I noticed that they had a vested interest that the more they could stoke division, the more they could step into the power vacuum and increase their own power. And so that's what I talk about, that kind of oligarchic elites, that we're not being controlled by a constitutional democracy anymore. We're being controlled by very powerful interests. And to me, that's not a conservative issue or a Democratic issue. That's a bipartisan issue that I'm trying to get hope is, or what I try to do is make that point so readers on both sides will understand that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we've talked a lot about all the issues and the problems. The next question, of course, is, okay, what do we do about it? What do you say in the book about solutions?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's when I finish all 8 of those positions, 2 in each quadrant. I mean, it's kind of dark, right? It's pretty discouraging to think there's any way we're going to get back to it. And at the end of the quadrants, I bring up this a thinker called Rusty Reno, R.R. Reno, and he has a book called The Return of the Strong Gods. And he says that the more the ruling oligarchic elite shut down conversation about meaningful topics and real important things in life, one of them being religion, for instance, the more that's off limits and bracketed out of our conversation, out of the public square, he says that the more people will tend towards the false strong gods. They're going to go to those things as they push back. And the goal for us is to not reach for those extreme strong gods, but to get to the right gods. They're still strong in the sense that they're meaningful in our lives, right? It's about community. It's about church. It's about our faith. It's about growing in Christ. It's about making a difference in the world. I mean, all of those things that Christians on the left and the right can agree on. So what I end up doing, right, is after I eliminate the positions in each of the quadrants that are outside of the vital center, I then spend 3 chapters looking at the vital center. And the first one's probably the most philosophical. There's a lot of heavy lifting there where I have to look at historically how our country looked at those 4 number 1 positions in the vital center. And then I do that. And then in the next chapter, I look at, I had to pick an issue that because I could have written a whole nother book on the new vital center. So what I do is I try and pick a topic that kind of came up often in my book, but also I think kind of encapsulates really what I've been talking about throughout the book. And so I look at immigration, and what I end up saying doing in that chapter, showing how the new vital center would make a strong appeal to new immigrants, to immigrants that are already here that aren't citizens, to citizens that are here that don't love our country. And I talk about this sweet offer of immigration based on this new vital center. And then I have a 3rd chapter on the role that Christianity plays in that. So that's kind of an overview of what I do in that final chapter. Oh, and then the concluding chapter, I should say, I look at the unique role that the church has, which I think could be heroic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So if there's one thing you'd like people to take away from the book, what would it be?
I think that particularly Christians, we've got to do deeper thinking. In the early part of the book, I talk about the need to recover a public philosophy. And the church has not spent a lot of time investing in what that looks like. I think the last major theologian pastor who worked in this area would have been Reinhold Niebuhr, right, back in the 30s and the 40s. We have not come up with a public philosophy. And this is my very humble attempt at putting forth a full-orbed public philosophy for the church that the church can use to kind of say, okay, this is where we need to say no to culture and polarization. This is where we need to say yes. And this is what it looks like. And this is how we can unify our very divided church, our very divided nation. But that it's going to take some heavy lifting, some deep thinking, a lot of work to figure out what this looks like. Because and if we don't do it, we'll just stay in our tribes. We'll continue to argue. We will eventually separate and eventually divorce. And I just don't want that to happen. I have too much love for our country and for the people of this country for that to happen. And I'm hopeful that the church, which represents one of the largest voting blocks in our country, can lead in this area and not always be following. I felt like in COVID, we were reacting all the time, both on the left and the right, always reacting, never leading. And then we can't lead until the church, its leaders, both in pastoral leadership, but in the seminaries and the colleges, all through the leadership in the business world and the nonprofit world, until we do the hard work of regaining a public philosophy that can stand up in these parlous times.
So looking forward, it sounds as though there's an opportunity for another book here. Are you already thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think logically, yeah, I appreciate that. That's good. I hope my editor is listening. Yeah, I mean, I think at the end, wasn't enough time to work out this for the church, so I have maybe a 15-page chapter at the end where I talk about the heroic role of the church and what this would look like in the church and how it could train its parishioners in thinking this way, not from the pulpit, but through the discipleship ministry and the Sunday school ministry and things like that. I'm also working on a shorter book on George Orwell. I've been studying him for years, and I kind of wanted to kind of get something done on that. So I feel like Orwell in 1984 is pretty relevant right now.
Yeah.
But yeah. So there's especially with all this, this kind of the surveillance culture that's going on, and the way high tech has really crazy power. I mean, even just this week, big tech, YouTube just canceled a very much left of center classical kind of liberal, just took all of his stuff off because it didn't like how he was challenging kind of the ruling elite. And so I think we're going to see that more and more. Up until this point, it's probably been more conservatives that have been pushing back, but we're going to see more and more. It's going to happen with kind of the classical liberals, those who would be closest into what I call the new vital center. So, doing something on Orwell could be relevant. So I'm just starting that, but I think the big part of the project, the Cold Civil War project, will be a book on how the church needs to live out the new vital center and how unifying it can be.
I think that would be important. No question, and needed.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I was curious what you thought. You looked at the book, we've had this discussion. What do you think I need to do? What's next? What's the next project?
Oh, well, I mean, I haven't been thinking about what the next book is, other than, as I mentioned, as part of my How to Heal Our Divides effort, I've been very focused on organizations that I feel are doing something about healing some of these different divides. So there's a set of organizations that are doing forums, of intentionally bringing together people on opposite sides of an issue and having, try to create some degree of understanding and common, not everybody has to agree, but at least, see if we can find some common ground. So Braver Angels, 3 practices, there's several like that are doing. The Colossian Forum, is another one, a little more of a religious orientation.
Yeah.
So I've been focused on, trying to raise awareness about organizations that are actually doing something, you know what I mean, to heal racial divides or political divides, things like that.
Yeah. And I'm familiar with, especially the Braver Angels. Got a good friend of mine at our church in Pasadena who's actually helped moderate. I think that's what he would have been called, a moderator of those. And they're super helpful. And that's the kind of thing that needs to be done in the church. I mean, I talk about in Cold Civil War, the divisions over, kind of pro woke, anti woke. But now we've even since my book was being written, you see the divisions over lockdowns and vaccines. I mean, somehow the church is going to have to come together, or we're just going to be blue churches and red churches, right? So some of those techniques that they're using probably need to be utilized in the church to get people talking again. And I'm hoping that my book, even if you disagree with parts of it or how I analyze the different parts of the quadrant, can be a useful exercise. That quadrant, where do you fit on this? How do we differ? How can we start dialoguing on our differences? And then we can find out what the things that we agree on and what we need to work on.
Do you have a discussion guide that goes along with the book?
I don't yet. I probably will work on it. What I've been working on over the last few days is just getting out the quadrant to people. I'm working on kind of a test that you can take, like those old Enneagram tests where you can find out where you fit. I want people to be able to take the test and say, oh, wow, I fit mostly on this part of the spectrum and you're way over there. There's a big divide between us, but maybe we can move towards the vital center. And how would we do that? I think that something like that is going to be a helpful exercise.
Good. All right. So again, the name of the book is Cold Civil War, Overcoming Polarization, Discovering Unity and Healing the Nation. Thanks very much, Jim, for all your work on that and for joining us today. And you can learn more at newvitalcenter.com. Thanks again, Jim.
Brian, thanks so much. It's been great.